Get off my flight. Pilot mocked elderly black veteran, then froze when he said, I own this airline. Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 219. Harold Jenkins woke before sunrise, the way he always did in the small brick house outside Atlanta he'd owned for 32 years. He made coffee in the same chipped mug his late wife Dorothy had given him for their 20th anniversary, fed the neighbor's cat that had adopted his porch 2 winters ago, and packed one duffel bag with a change of clothes, his medication, and a paperback Western he'd already read twice. He was 71 years old, a retired Army sergeant who had done 2 tours before most of the flight crew he'd meet that day were even born. And he had learned a long time ago that dignity doesn't need to raise its voice to be real. He put on his corduroy jacket, the one with the frayed cuffs, and his olive cap that read, Vietnam Veteran, in cracked gold letters. And he called a cab because his knee, wrecked by an old jump injury, didn't do well with long walks anymore. He was flying to Denver to see his granddaughter graduate from nursing school, and he'd bought himself a first-class ticket as a small gift to himself, something he did maybe twice a year, not because he needed the extra legroom, though he did, but because he'd spent 40 years being told certain rooms weren't built for men like him, and he'd decided a long time ago he wasn't going to keep agreeing with that. At gate C-14, the terminal buzzed with the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning. A mother chasing a toddler in socks, a businessman shouting into a Bluetooth earpiece about a merger, a cluster of college kids laughing over iced coffee, a gate agent double-checking a stroller tag. Nobody looked twice at Harold. That suited him fine. He sat in a corner seat, duffel bag between his feet, and watched the planes taxi outside the window, the way he had watched runways his whole life. First as a young paratrooper waiting to jump into places he couldn't have found on a map, and now as an old man, waiting to see a girl he'd held as a newborn walk across a stage in a cap and gown. When his boarding group was called, he rose slowly, boarding pass folded in his shirt pocket, and made his way down the jet bridge. The gate agent scanning passes a young man named Devin gave Harold's pass a second look before waving him through. Not suspicion exactly, more a flicker of surprise, the kind of look Harold had gotten his whole life and had stopped letting sting. He stepped onto the aircraft and the cool, recycled air and the smell of coffee and leather greeted him the way it always did. First class, cream seats, warm overhead lighting, the quiet hum of a cabin not yet full. A flight attendant named Brianna Cole stood near the galley, tablet in hand, running through her boarding checklist with the crisp efficiency of someone who took pride in a tight cabin. She glanced up as Harold approached row 2, and something in her face shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing behind her eyes, before she'd even consciously registered why. She stepped into the aisle. Sir, can I see your boarding pass? Harold handed it over without a word. She studied it, then looked at him, then back at the pass as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something that matched the picture in her head. This says 2A, she said. First class. That's right, Harold said. Did someone book this for you? Sometimes there's a mix-up with companion passes. I booked it myself, Harold said evenly. Card's in my wallet if you need to see it. Her smile tightened, the professional kind that never reaches the eyes. I just need to verify a few things. Could you step aside a moment? She walked to the front galley to find Gary Osei, the lead flight attendant, a heavy-set man in his 40s who had flown premium cabins for over a decade and prided himself on smoothing over problems before they became visible. He looked at the pass, looked at Harold standing patiently in the aisle, and frowned with the particular caution of a man trained to avoid conflict rather than resolve it. Sir, we're going to need a moment to confirm your seat assignment, Gary said. Sometimes the system generates duplicates. It scanned fine at the gate, Harold said quietly. I understand. We just want everything in order before pushback. Harold nodded and stepped aside, letting other first-class passengers file past him into their seats. A woman in 1B glanced up from her magazine, took in his corduroy jacket and worn duffel bag, and looked back down, though her shoulders had gone stiff. A man in 1D lowered his newspaper an inch, watching over the top of it, the way people watch a fire they hope won't spread to them. Nobody offered Harold a seat. Nobody offered him water. He simply stood in the aisle, an old man with a bad knee, holding nothing but patience while somebody else decided whether his own boarding pass was real. That was when Captain William Doyle stepped out of the cockpit. Doyle was 58, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, a man who had commanded aircraft for 30 years and believed with the quiet certainty of long habit that 30 years had taught him to read a cabin in a glance. He took in the scene, an elderly black man in a worn jacket standing in first class, a nervous young attendant, a lead attendant frowning at a piece of paper, and his mind assembled a story before anyone told him one. "What's the holdup?" Doyle asked. "Possible seating discrepancy," Gary said. Doyle studied Harold the way a man studies a puzzle piece that doesn't belong in the box. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back toward the boarding door while we sort this out. We don't want to delay the flight." "I've been standing here 5 minutes with a valid pass in your attendant's hand," Harold said, his voice steady. "I'm not the one causing a delay." "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," Doyle said, though Harold's voice had not risen at all. A young man 3 rows back lifted his phone, sensing drama before he understood it. A woman near the front murmured something to her husband. The cabin, which had been humming with ordinary boarding noise minutes earlier, went quiet in that particular way cabins go quiet, right before a story breaks open. "I'm a veteran," Harold said, not as a threat, just as a fact laid plainly on the table. "I've flown this airline 15 years. I'd like my boarding pass back, and I'd like to sit down." "Sir, until we confirm your ticket, I can't allow you to take that seat," Doyle said. "If this becomes disruptive, I'll have no choice but to have you removed." Something in Harold's chest went very still. Not fear. Recognition, the old familiar weight of being doubted, simply for existing somewhere he wasn't expected. He'd felt it in banks, in courthouses, walking home from work decades ago, while patrol cars slowed to watch him. He'd hoped foolishly, maybe that 71 years might have bought him some peace from it. It hadn't. "Then call whoever you need to call," Harold said quietly. "But you won't intimidate me off a flight I paid for." Doyle's radio crackled as he requested gate security, and the cabin held its breath. Officer Renee Alvarez boarded 8 minutes later. A calm, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with 15 years in airport law enforcement. She had seen every version of this situation. Genuine fraud, honest confusion, and more often than she liked to admit, exactly this. She took in the scene the way Doyle should have. An elderly man standing quietly, a boarding pass in someone else's hand. No raised voice, no aggressive movement, and a growing audience of passengers who looked more uncomfortable by the second. "What's going on?" she asked. "Possible fraudulent boarding pass," Doyle said. Passenger became argumentative when questioned. "I did not," Harold said evenly. "I asked for my pass back." Alvarez turned to Gary. "Has anyone actually rescanned this or checked the manifest?" Gary blinked. No, not yet." "Let me see it," Alvarez said, holding out her hand. She scanned it herself with a handheld reader clipped to her belt. The screen blinked green. "Harold R. Jenkins, SEAT 2A, confirmed." She looked up at Doyle, and something in her expression made the captain's certainty falter for the first time. "It's valid," she said simply. The cabin exhaled, though the tension didn't break so much as change shape. Passengers who'd been filming lowered their phones slightly, some looking embarrassed now, others still waiting to see how the story would end. Doyle, cornered but unwilling to yield completely, straightened his shoulders. "Even so, given the disruption, Captain," Alvarez interrupted. "There's no disruption here, except the one your crew created. This man has a confirmed seat. Let him sit down." Harold didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, took his boarding pass from Gary's hand, and walked the last few steps to seat 2A. He lowered himself slowly, his need protesting, and looked out the window at the gray morning sky, saying nothing. But the story wasn't finished. As Harold reached up to place his duffel bag in the overhead bin, his sleeve rode up, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm, jump wings, and a number, 82nd ABN, 1974. Something about it tugged at a memory in Brianna's mind, though she couldn't place why. She stepped closer without quite meaning to. "Sir," she said, her voice different now, uncertain in a new way. "Is your name Harold Jenkins?" He looked at her, surprised. "That's right." Her face went pale. Are you the Harold Jenkins who testified before Congress, back in the 90s about the airline merger?" "That was a long time ago," Harold said, watching her carefully. Brianna sat down abruptly in the empty seat across the aisle, as though her legs had simply stopped working. "My grandfather worked ground crew here in 1994. He used to tell me about a black investor, a veteran who put up his own money to save the airline from bankruptcy when nobody else would touch it. He called him the man who saved our jobs. He said this man believed in the company back when it employed maybe 200 people before the merger, before it became what it is now." She looked at Harold, eyes wide. "That was you." The cabin, still listening, went quiet again, but this time, the silence carried a different weight. Harold folded his hands in his lap. "I put some money into a small regional carrier in 1994, he said simply. "I'd just come home from 20 years of service, took a construction job, saved what I could. A friend introduced me to a young man trying to keep 3 airplanes in the air. Everyone told me not to do it. I did it anyway. Worked out fine." "You still hold shares," Brianna said slowly, the pieces arranging themselves in real time. "You're on the board. I've seen your name in the annual report. I just never connected it to a face." Doyle, still standing at the front of the cabin, felt the floor shift beneath him in a way turbulence never had. "Wait," he said. "You're on the board of directors?" Harold looked at him, not with anger, but with something heavier, tired clarity. "I am, which means captain in about an hour when this flight lands, and I file an incident report. You and I are going to have a very different conversation than the one we just had." Doyle's face drained of color. "Mr. Jenkins, we didn't know." "That's the problem," Harold said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet cabin. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect. You needed to see an old man with a valid boarding pass and take his word for it, the same way you'd have taken the word of that gentleman in 1D without blinking." He nodded toward the businessman with the newspaper, who suddenly found something urgent to examine outside his window. Doyle swallowed hard. "Sir, I take full responsibility. I acted on assumptions I shouldn't have made." "I know," Harold said. "That's exactly what worries me, because I guarantee I'm not the first passenger this crew has looked at and decided before a word was spoken didn't belong." Brianna's eyes filled. "I've done that," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not just today, before too. I told myself I was being careful, thorough, but I wasn't being thorough. I was being afraid of something I couldn't even name." She looked at Harold directly. "I'm sorry, not because of who you turned out to be, because of what I did before I knew." Harold studied her for a long moment. There was something in her voice that told him this apology, unlike Doyle's, wasn't about damage control. It was a young woman looking honestly at herself for maybe the first time in a while and not liking everything she saw. "That matters," he said. "More than you know." Officer Alvarez, meanwhile, had begun quietly taking statements, not because Harold demanded it, but because procedure required documenting any onboard security escalation, valid or not. She spoke first with Gary, who admitted, red-faced, that no one had actually cross-checked the manifest before calling security. She spoke with the businessman in 1D, who confessed sheepishly that he'd assumed the worst the moment he saw Harold's jacket and cap. And then, almost as an afterthought, she pulled up the airline's internal incident log on her tablet, a routine step, and paused. "Captain Doyle," she said slowly, "this isn't the first complaint filed against this specific gate-to-cabin handoff process this year. There are 2 other incidents flagged in the last 4 months, one involving an elderly Latino passenger in business class, one involving a black family denied priority boarding despite valid tickets. Both closed as customer service resolved with a travel voucher. Neither reached compliance review." The cabin listening went colder than the recycled air could explain. Doyle's jaw tightened. Those were unrelated situations. Were they? Harold asked quietly. Or were they the same pattern wearing a different flight number? Nobody answered him. The flight was delayed 40 minutes while ground operations reviewed the incident at Harold's specific request, not out of spite, but because he wanted it documented properly, not buried in a customer service form somewhere and forgotten by dinner. When the airline's regional manager, a brisk woman named Patricia Lund, arrived at the gate, prepared to smooth things over with the practiced language of corporate apology, Harold stopped her before she finished her first sentence. "I don't want anyone fired today," he said. "I want something better than that. I want Captain Doyle and Ms. Cole to sit down with your diversity and inclusion office, not as punishment, but as a real conversation. I want your gate agents retrained, so a 5-second visual assumption never again overrides a system that already confirms someone belongs in their seat. And I want your board to see the actual numbers on how often passengers who look like me get pulled aside for discrepancies compared to passengers who don't. Officer Alvarez just found 2 more examples in 4 months. I'd like to know how many more nobody bothered to look for." Patricia nodded slowly, stunned by the calm precision of the request. "I'll make sure that happens personally." "I know you will," Harold said, "because I'll be checking." Before the flight finally pushed back, Harold did something nobody expected. A young soldier, maybe 22, had been sitting in economy flying home for the first time in over a year after deployment overseas. His knees jammed against the seat in front of him, exhaustion written plainly across his face. Harold had noticed him at the gate that morning. He walked back through the cabin now, found the young man, and offered to switch seats. The soldier protested, embarrassed, but Harold insisted, smiling for the first time all morning. "I've had my turn up front today," he said. "Go stretch your legs. You've earned it more than I have." Brianna, watching from the galley, felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since boarding began. Doyle watched too, silent, quietly recalculating everything he thought he understood about the difference between authority and decency. The flight took off an hour late. Nobody complained. 3 weeks later, Captain William Doyle sat across a conference table from the airline's Vice President of Inclusion and Culture in a windowless room, instead of a cockpit listening. Really listening maybe for the first time in his career, to data he'd never once thought to ask for. Complaint patterns broken down by route, by crew rotation, by the quiet architecture of assumption that had been operating beneath his flights for years without his noticing. He didn't lose his job. He lost something he needed to lose instead. The certainty that 30 years of experience meant he had nothing left to learn. He asked near the end of the meeting if he could personally call Harold Jenkins. He did that evening from his kitchen table, and the 2 men talked for 40 minutes, not about the incident, but about service. Doyle's years flying cargo runs into hostile airspace decades ago. Harold's years jumping out of planes into places training never fully prepared him for. By the end of the call, something like respect had grown in the space where assumption used to live. Brianna Cole requested a transfer into the airline's new customer advocacy training program, where she now helps design onboarding modules for incoming flight attendants, built around a principle she insisted on writing into the very first training slide. Verify the system before you trust your instinct. She kept Harold's boarding pass number in a note on her phone, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of the exact moment she'd almost let a habit she didn't know she had cost someone their dignity. Officer Renee Alvarez's discovery of the earlier incidents triggered a formal compliance review that eventually reached the airline's board, Harold's board, resulting in a mandatory retraining program rolled out across every hub the airline operated, along with a new verification protocol that required a manifest check before any boarding pass could be challenged in front of other passengers. It wasn't headline news. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply quieter, steadier, and it mattered more than any apology could have. And Harold Jenkins still flies twice a month, sometimes coach, sometimes first class, in the same corduroy jacket, the same veteran's cap, carrying nothing to prove and needing nothing proven, because he has always known exactly who he is. What changed wasn't him. It was everyone else finally catching up. Back in the cockpit, Tonight, rain streaking soft lines down the windshield. I think about Harold Jenkins more than I probably should. About how close an entire cabin came to doing something that could never have been taken back, all because a boarding pass didn't match a picture in someone's head. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not status, that truly separates us. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone misjudged before anyone bothered to ask their name?